Let's turn our attentions to what's happening in the Middle East. We saw the horrific news over the weekend that 6 Israeli hostages being held by Hamas in tunnels in the state basically were summarily executed, murdered, point-blank range, shot in the head by the Hamas terrorists, holding them just as IDF soldiers were approaching, hopefully near enough to rescue those hostages. This has prompted an outcry back in Israel. Calls of a general strike today, demonstrations on the street demanding that Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli Prime Minister, returns to the negotiating table, signs a peace deal with Hamas to get the remaining hostages home alive, crucially. Well, let's talk about this with Jonathan Sacerdoti. He's a writer and a broadcaster and is a former campaigner against anti-Semitism here in the UK. Good morning to you, Jonathan.
Morning, Julia.
Thank you so much for joining us. I mean, this is absolute tragedy, particularly of the fact that these 6 hostages in their 20s and 30s, one aged 40, have been held all this time. I mean, you know, we are looking at, 11 months, still alive, held in a tunnel, but it is thought that they were basically murdered by their hostage takers because the IDF was getting close to being able to rescue them. But the backlash against this from not just those hostages' families, but other families of hostages and many other thousands more, has really surprised me in Israel. The pressure is all on Netanyahu. He's being blamed for their deaths. Talk us through why that's happening.
Many Israelis are very angry with Benjamin Netanyahu. Don't forget, he was the Prime Minister who was in charge at the time of the attack on October the 7th. So there is that. He's also somebody who had a reputation for security, keeping Israelis safe. And all of that was shattered on October the 7th. There is, I think, some argument to be made that it's a bit unfair that so much pressure is being put on him right now about the hostages. He isn't necessarily the person who's able to release them. In fact, he has had over half the hostages that were taken on October the 7th released or rescued. So where there has been the ability to make a deal, he's shown himself willing to do so, and he did that in that first hostage release deal that he made. People are critical now because they feel that he is maybe putting conditions on the negotiations that have been taking place.
Which, of course, is his job as the Israeli Prime Minister. I mean,
exactly.
This is the thing I find quite bizarre.
And I think that really in terms of negotiating, often what one says publicly and what goes on behind the scenes are very different. So if there is no hope, for example, that Hamas would agree to the deal, and that does seem to be what's been happening since November, they've not agreed to any conditions. Even Biden and Blinken, who've been very critical and putting a lot of pressure on Netanyahu, have said in recent weeks that actually Israel's agreed to everything, Hamas is not agreeing. So if that's the case, I think we could understand why Netanyahu and the Israeli government would be taking strong positions, because any sign of weakness in concession, if it isn't met with a deal and release of the hostages, is actually going to have a negative effect for the country, both now and in the future. So I do think that protesting is perhaps a bit unfair, but, you know, it's not my place to say. Israelis are welcome to go out on the streets and protest.
Well, crucial thing, of course, you can go out and demonstrate. Yes, we had police action to deal with, some of the, big worst antics, but nevertheless, it's a democratic free nation. People are able to demonstrate. But this is the thing. I mean, some of the things that Netanyahu is, saying are sticking points is the ability to, basically, keep control in Gaza along the Egyptian border. But that would be absolutely crucial in ensuring Israel's future safety, because, of course, that's where Hamas had all the tunnels and been bringing in so much of the munitions they've been using against Israel over the last few years, through those tunnels. So these seem to be very reasonable. But this is the issue, isn't it? If it was your family being held hostage, you'd agree to anything to get them home. Of course you would. But that's, of course, why these hostage negotiations aren't carried out by the families, because of course what they're willing to do and what would actually be the right thing to do for the rest of Israel in terms of future safety is very, very different. And I'm sure, like you actually, I don't hold a candle for Benjamin Netanyahu and his government, but nevertheless, they are in a very difficult position. Pressure not just at home, but pressure also from, the Western allies, supposedly, for them to agree to anything and everything to try and end the war in Gaza. And as you say, again and again, it is Hamas that is choosing to continue to hold the hostages, and Hamas choosing to continue to fire on Israel, and Hamas that is refusing to come to any reasonable deal. And it seems to me that these protesters are doing Hamas's work for them.
I can't say that the families of the hostages are necessarily doing Hamas's work for them, but certainly a level of pressure put on the Prime Minister and the government isn't necessarily going to help in the negotiations, because over the year before October the 7th, there was a lot of division within Israel because of decisions taken by that government, that coalition, that Prime Minister. And certainly there are some indications that Hamas and the Palestinian terrorists and Iran all saw that, and this had played some part in their planning of how and when to carry out that massacre, that brutal invasion. So Israel's always in a difficult position because its people have every right to want more from their government, as any population does in a democratic country. But often, if they make their dissatisfaction known too loudly, then it can signal to their enemies that there are internal weaknesses. And I do think Hamas knows how to play on that. And let's not forget that Benjamin Netanyahu oversaw the Gilad Shalit deal, which saw over 1,000 Palestinian prisoners, people convicted of murders and terrorism, released in return for one Israeli soldier. One of those people who was released was in fact Sinwar, now the head of Hamas, believed to be hiding in tunnels. He met with some of the hostages themselves. They've said that, those who've been released. So he's a very keen watcher of Israel and the divisions within Israel. He learnt Hebrew in Israeli prison. He follows the Israeli news. He will be seeing all of this as well. And these considerations will be taken on board.
They actually undermine the argument, don't they? But again, we understand that Sinwar is holed up in tunnels somewhere, probably in Rafah, and he had reports in Israel claiming they have 20 Israeli hostages handcuffed basically around him, preventing any attack on him, because of course the loss of 20 Israeli hostages would be unacceptable. And again, making it impossible for Israel to end this. Really appreciate you joining us, Jonathan Sacerdoti. Thank you very much indeed.